Okay, guys, welcome. Today we're going to talk about understanding the federal budget. Okay. Now, most of the federal budget works just like your personal budget or the budget of a small business, right? You have, a couple different terms that we'll talk about here. You have receipts, which you can really just think of as your income. And this, of course, is money that has been collected. You have outlays, which you can think of as expenses. And of course, this is money that's been spent. And your net income is your receipts minus your outlays, right? Or your income minus your expenses. Now, if your net income is positive, we say that the budget has a surplus. And if the net income is negative, we say that the budget has a deficit. Okay, so in this example, we're going to figure out if we have a deficit or a surplus for a budget. So we're going to suppose that our gross income was $40,000. And that we have that our expenditures were $20,000 for rent and food, $2,000 for interest, $6,000 for car expenses, and $9,000 for entertainment and miscellaneous expenses, and $8,000 in taxes. Now, did we have a deficit or a surplus? Well, if we add all of our expenditures, we have 22, 28, 37,000, and then this puts us to 45,000. So if I look at my net income, I'm going to do 40,000 minus the 45,000, and we're going to get a negative 5,000. So since this is negative, this is a deficit. All right, so that's what we mean by a deficit and a surplus. Now, the words deficit and debt are usually used interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. Now, when you talk about the deficit, that is money that's borrowed or taken from a savings during a single year, right? Now, the debt is the running total of all money that's owed to lenders, right? And this could be the result of accumulating deficits over many years, right? So when you hear deficit, you want to think a single year. And when you think debt, you want to think of the accumulation of all debt, all deficits, I should say, right? Now, we have a table in the textbook that I copied down here for us. Now, we're going to assume that the $47,000 interest payment in 2013, so if we go to 2013, and this is all in thousands, so my $47,000 interest payment is right here, was in 2013, and that was for the 2012 debt of $566,000, this number right here. So we want to know what was the annual interest rate. Now, if the interest rate remains the same, what would the payment be on the debt at the end of 2013? So we would want to calculate that for this amount right here. And of course, what would the payment be if the interest rate were to rise by 2 percentage points? So first we need to figure out the interest rate of this 47th. So we know that if we take our $566,000 and multiply it by some interest rate, R, we're going to get that the interest is $47,000. Okay, so we can get R by dividing both sides by 566,000. And if we do that, that's going to give us that our interest rate here. So let's do 47 divided by 566,000. And that would give us an interest rate of 8.3% roughly. Okay. So now the next part of this is that if we were to assume that the interest rate remains the same, what would the payment be on the debt at the end of 2013? So then we would need to figure out, well, what's 8.3% of 773,000? 773,000 times 8.3% or 0.083. So I need to take 773,000 times 0.083, and we would be paying $64,159 on interest. Now, of course, the last part of this is what if it was 2 percentage points higher? So then I would need to take 773,000 and multiply it by 10.103, right? Or 10.3%, right? And if I do that, then we'd be jumping up to a $79,619 interest payment. All right. So that's a look at how we can, of course, when you're dealing with the budgets of small companies or entire countries, you can be looking at some pretty big numbers here. Now, I gave sort of a rough sketch on some of the figures that are in the textbook. And this will, of course, showcase, again, the difference between what we mean by a surplus and a deficit. And then, of course, compare that to what we mean by debt. Now, for this first graph here, we have that if the graph is below the x-axis, that means that we had a deficit in that year. And of course, if it's above, that means that we had a surplus in that year, right? Now, if you look at the corresponding debt graph to the right here, you'll see that all of this negative stuff right here is going to correlate to this graph going up on the debt chart. Right now, in those couple of years where we had a surplus, that's where you start to see it level off and start to go down a little bit, right? But then, of course, once you start to get into the big deficits here, then you're seeing your debt skyrocket again, right? Of course, these are rough sketches, and you can look in the textbook for better drawings, but that's sort of the idea of what's going on. Okay. Now, the federal debt at the end of 2013 was approximately $17 trillion. Now, if this debt were divided evenly among the roughly 315 million citizens of the United States, how much would each person owe? All right, so this is an interesting problem. Let's take a look at this. So 17 trillion is 17. All right, the next one would be billions. This one would be millions. This is thousands, and this is ones. So it's 17 with 12 zeros after it. It's quite a lot of money. Now we're dividing this by 315 million. So this is just 315 with 6 zeros after it. Right? And if we do this, this would give how much each person would owe if they were to divide the deficit among the citizens. Right? So 17 trillion, and if I divide that by 315 million, that would give me $553,968.25. All right, so that's quite a lot of money for quite a lot of people in order to pay off this debt, this federal debt. And of course, now 7 years in the future, it's probably even worse. It's probably much worse than that. Okay. Now, of course, we can talk about revenues versus spending because the reason why the government's debt is as large as it is because it's a result of too much spending and too little revenue for too long a time. Right? Now, there's a figure in the textbook that shows how spending and receipts for the government relates to what's called the gross domestic product, which is the most commonly used measure of the size of the national economy. Right? And you can see that similar to the previous graphs that we looked at, in most of these years here, our spending is above the revenue, which would contribute to accumulating a deficit in that year or accumulating debt over time. Right, so that's sort of the idea behind that graph. Now, economists also commonly consider deficit and debt numbers as percentages of gross domestic product. Now, for 2012, the gross domestic product was 15.6 trillion, the total deficit was 1.1 trillion, and the end of year debt was 16.1 trillion. So we're going to find the deficit and debt as percentages of the gross domestic product. Okay, so if we want to find each of these as percentages, then the deficit would be 1.1 trillion divided by 15.6 trillion. So the debt, if I divide these and then multiply by 100, this would give me a 7.05%. Right, so the deficit is 7.05% of the gross domestic product. And for the debt, I would need to take 16.1 trillion and divide it by 15.6 trillion. And whoops, I think I entered this in 16.1 divided by 15.6. And then that would give us a 103.21%. So the debt would be 103.21% of the gross domestic product. Okay. Now the last few things that we'll talk about, first start with spending. And you have that spending will fall into two separate groups. You have what are called mandatory outlays, which are expenses that are paid automatically unless Congress acts to change them. Right? So most of the mandatory outlays are for entitlements, so things like such as Social Security, Medicare, and other payments to individuals. Now, interest on the debt is also a mandatory outlay because it must be paid to prevent the government from being in default on its loans. Right? And then you also have discretionary outlays, which are ones that Congress must vote on each year and that the president must sign into law. So in the spending pie chart, discretionary expenses are subdivided, all right, so even further into those that affect national defense and security and all the rest, right? So non-defense discretionary. So that would include things like education, roads and transportation, agriculture, food and safety, consumer protection, housing, the space program, energy development, scientific research, international aid, and basically every other government program that you've ever heard of. Okay. So the last example that we'll do is that in 2012, interest on the debt totaled $360 billion. And the total debt at the time was $16 trillion. So first, what was the annual interest rate paid by the government? So let's just do this one piece at a time. We'll do that first. So I know that if I take 16 trillion and I multiply it by some interest rate R, I'm going to get 360 billion. Right? So of course, if I want to get R, I'm going to divide both sides by the 16 trillion. So let me just do that for this side. And on this side, we can make our life a little bit easier by canceling out some zeros. All right, so I have 360 billion over 16 trillion. So I can cancel out my zeros. And then so I want to calculate 36 over 1600. And then once I multiply that by 100, that will give me my interest rate. So 36 divided by 1600, oops, would give me that the interest rate is 2.25%. All right, so that's a pretty low interest rate, but you're still getting $360 billion of interest. All right, so now the next part of this is to suppose that the interest rates paid by the government had been at their historical average at about 3%. So how would that have affected the interest payment? Well, if we do 16 trillion times 2.25% or 0.0225, so let's calculate that. Times 0.0225, then that would give us that we're going to have, and now it's rounding it for me, but we're going to get 3.6 times 10 to the 11th, which would be 36, and then 10 zeros after it, right? So it's just going to round it for me. Oh, because that would be because I multiplied it by the same thing. So let's try multiplying it by 0.03 instead. And that would make it jump up to, so this was actually 0.03. Right, and that would make this jump up to $480 billion. So we're lucky that the interest rates were as low as they were. Otherwise, we would have jumped up to $480 billion. Right? So that's an interesting example to look at there. All right, so that concludes this video on understanding the federal budget. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.